The summer of 1845 found Britain at the peak of its power, an empire so vast and sure of itself that the blank spots on the world map were seen not as mysteries, but as mere delays, waiting for British lines to be drawn across them. Down on the Thames River, two rugged ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sat low in the water. Their names were already part of naval legend. These were no ordinary vessels. They were veterans of the Antarctic, their hulls reinforced to withstand the crushing power of polar ice. Now, they were being repurposed for one last great puzzle, the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic that would finally link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. For centuries, this passage had defied Europe's best efforts, but in Victorian Britain, defiance was just an invitation to try harder. Technology was advancing, naval discipline was absolute, and a tide of confidence flowed out from London. These ships weren't going north to see if the passage existed. They were going as agents of destiny, to prove it was inevitable. At the heart of this grand endeavor was Sir John Franklin. He was almost 60, a man whose face was a testament to a long life at sea. His reputation was built on stubborn perseverance, not flashy genius. He had faced starvation before, marched through Arctic winters on meager rations, and buried his men only to press on. To his superiors, Franklin's solid, dependable nature was his greatest strength. He was reliable, God-fearing, and would follow his orders to the letter. While younger, more ambitious officers might chase personal glory, Franklin would simply get the job done. He was chosen not to outsmart the unknown, but to endure it until it gave way. The entire expedition was designed around this philosophy of endurance. The Erebus and Terror were not sleek, fast ships. They were tough, stubborn survivors. Their oak frames were sheathed in iron plating, their bows reinforced to act like battering rams against the ice. In a nod to modern technology, steam engines taken from railway locomotives were installed to give them an edge against tricky winds or encroaching ice. Their propellers could even be lifted out of the water to prevent damage. Below decks, advanced heating systems promised warmth, and desalination units would provide fresh water. To the Victorians, these were not just improvements. They were proof that humanity was finally taming nature's wildest frontiers. Where ice once held absolute power, now machinery could negotiate terms. Provisioning the ships was an incredible act of faith in industrial abundance. They loaded enough food to last 129 men for 3 full years. Much of it was preserved in tins, a relatively new technology. Thousands upon thousands of cans filled with meat, soup, and vegetables were hastily soldered shut to meet the Admiralty's tight deadline. Every spare corner of the ships was crammed with flour, tea, sugar, and of course, rum. They believed lime juice would be enough to ward off the dreaded disease of scurvy. Good hygiene and strict order were expected to keep the crew healthy. Each man was equipped with woolens, furs, thick boots, and heavy bedding, all designed to fend off a cold so intense it was almost unimaginable. The air in the holds was thick with the smells of tar, metal, and stored ambition. The crew of 129 officers and men came from all walks of the Royal Navy. There were young lieutenants dreaming of promotion, experienced warrant officers who knew the routines by heart, and sailors long accustomed to discipline and hardship. Some had seen the Arctic before, while others were new to the ice, but certainly not new to a tough life. They all knew the risks, but in the face of duty, steady pay, and the chance to be a part of history, those risks seemed distant and abstract. On the shore, their families watched them go, putting on a brave face that hid a deep-seated dread beneath their pride. The plan was simple. Letters would arrive, then there would be a long silence, and then the triumphant return. This was the expected story. Franklin was the undisputed commander, but the leadership was carefully structured. His second-in-command, Francis Crozier, captained a Terror. He was an Irishman, a seasoned polar veteran known for his quiet, realistic approach. Aboard the Erebus with Franklin was James Fitzjames, a younger, more charismatic officer who embodied the boundless self-confidence of the new naval generation. These different personalities all existed within a rigid system that valued obedience above all else. Orders flowed down from the top, reports flowed up from the bottom, and any doubt or dissent rarely found an official voice. In their planning, the Arctic wasn't seen as a living, unpredictable adversary. It was just a piece of terrain to be crossed by sticking to the plan. On May 19, 1845, the ships were towed down the river. Crowds lined the banks, cheering them on as if it were a parade. Flags flew, bands played, and the newspapers reported on the grand departure. There was no sense of a final, dangerous farewell. The voyage was framed as difficult, yes, but ultimately manageable. The Admiralty's instructions were written with a confidence that bordered on casual. They trusted that the men would spend the winter where they had to, push forward when they could, and eventually emerge into the Pacific. The Empire was patient. The ice, they believed, would have no choice but to comply. As the ships reached the open sea, the familiar routines of naval life took over. Watches were set, logs were meticulously kept, and drills were run. Franklin placed a strong emphasis on order, religious services, and keeping morale high. Hymns were sung on deck, lectures were prepared for the long winter nights, and the ship's libraries were unpacked. The officers even planned to put on plays and hold readings, confident that the habits of civilization could insulate the men from the bleakness of the Arctic. They believed they could domesticate the wild north, not just with iron and steam, but with culture itself, as if reciting Shakespeare or scripture could somehow hold the frost at bay. The crossing of the North Atlantic was smooth. They made steady progress toward Greenland, passing whaling ships that exchanged news and noted their confident course. These brief encounters only reinforced the expedition's sense of purpose. Whalers worked these waters, but only for a season. Franklin's men were going to push further, to stay longer, to conquer. When they reached the Danish settlement at Desko Bay in Greenland, they made their final preparations. Oxen were brought aboard and slaughtered for one last taste of fresh meat. Sled dogs were purchased, and final letters were sent home. These letters were the last tangible links to their world, compressing love, hope, and fear onto paper before being sent back across the ocean. From this point on, the map grew thin, and they were on their own. Underlying every single decision was an unspoken assumption that the unknown was fundamentally knowable. They believed that any suffering could be measured, and if it could be measured, it could be managed. The expedition wasn't prepared for improvisation, it was prepared for endurance. They trusted that their combination of experience, technology, and sheer moral fiber would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Even the ships' names told a story of conquest. Erebus, named for the darkness of the underworld, and Terror, for fear itself, were now being used as tools of British mastery. To sail them north was to declare that even the darkest, most terrifying places on Earth could be entered, catalogued, and left behind. As the coast of Greenland faded from view and the water grew colder, the men settled into the rhythm of their mission. It felt as if it was already half accomplished. The hardest work was still ahead, of course, but they felt prepared for it. Franklin's own letters were calm, reflecting no sense of urgency or fear, only a quiet purpose. Winter would come, but winter was just a season, not a final judgment. The ice would appear, but it would be met with methodical precision. The ships pushed onward, driven by the quiet momentum of belief. They carried with them the full weight of an empire's expectations and the personal hopes of every man on board. Every timber in the ships, every tin of food, every rule in the book embodied the conviction that the Arctic was the last remaining obstacle in a world that had otherwise been mastered. The Franklin expedition didn't begin in fear or desperation. It began in an assurance so total, so complete, that it barely registered as an emotion. It was the calm before the storm, the moment when absolute confidence completely overshadowed imagination, while the North awaited its visitors in perfect, cold silence. The water darkened as latitude increased. The sea itself seemed to thicken, becoming a colder, heavier substance that was less willing to part for the passing hulls of the ships. Ice appeared first, as just a few white flecks, drifting past like scattered pages from a lost book. But soon, they grew into broader flows that nudged the ships with a sound like knuckles knocking on a door. For men who were used to the fury of storms and the ocean's swell, this was a different kind of resistance, patient, quiet, and absolutely relentless. Still, they pushed on. Sails were trimmed with care, and steam engines were engaged when the wind died. The crews were fast learners, picking up the subtle signals of polar navigation. As they sailed further, their charts became less reliable. Confident, detailed coastlines dissolved into guesswork and conjecture. But the ships, the Erebus and the Terror, advanced under a powerful assumption that what lay ahead was merely unmapped, not truly unknown. Baffin Bay opened before them, serving as both a gateway and a narrowing corridor. It was a funnel through which all Western ambitions had to pass. Here, the expedition entered waters haunted by the ghosts of earlier attempts. The names of those who came before Parry Ross back were etched faintly into Admiralty memory. Each had pressed forward until the ice simply said, "No more." But Sir John Franklin's orders were explicit: push west through Lancaster Sound, then turn south. He could choose between Wellington Channel or Peel Sound, depending on the conditions. There was a choice, but it was a choice within a rigid framework, one that prized progress above all else. Retreat was not an option. Every mile gained was a statement of intent. Every delay was just a temporary inconvenience. Along the Arctic's fringe, the crews encountered the seasonal traffic of whaling ships. These vessels rode at anchor, their holds heavy with oil, their captains curious about the Royal Navy's purpose so far north. The meetings were cordial and brief. They exchanged information about ice conditions, the weather, and the best routes. The whalers spoke of heavy pack ice that was lingering late into the season. They warned of narrow leads of open water that would appear and then vanish without warning. Franklin listened. He nodded. He recorded everything in his log, but his course did not waver. The whalers knew they had to turn south before the great freeze-up, but Erebus and Terror would not. At the mouth of Lancaster Sound, the two expedition ships were sighted by a pair of whalers, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise. The captains of these ships would later recall the meeting with striking clarity. It was the last confirmed European observation of the Franklin expedition. Flags were raised, greetings were shouted across the ice-choked water, and then the Navy vessels continued westward with a steady, unshakable resolve. No one saw any sign of distress, no hint of hesitation. The men lined the rails, a final moment of shared humanity, before the distance closed behind them like a heavy door. Beyond that point, the Arctic absorbed the expedition into its own strange rhythms. The sun circled the sky without setting, casting a constant, slanted light that threw off sleep schedules and sharpened the edge of fatigue. Watches blurred into one another. The very concept of night became theoretical. The ice demanded constant, unbroken vigilance. Leads that looked like clear passages in the morning could seal shut by afternoon, grinding massive floes together with a force that tested the strongest hulls and the bravest nerves. The ships advanced in fits and starts. Sometimes they sailed freely on open water, other times they inched forward under steam power, and often they stopped altogether, waiting for the ice to reconsider its grip. Despite the hardships, morale remained outwardly strong. The sheer novelty of the environment, the profound sense of being where so few had ever gone, sustained their interest. The officers sketched the barren coastlines and the fantastic ice formations, trying to reconcile what they saw with what their charts suggested. Every misty headland was a candidate for a new name, every channel a potential route to the Pacific. The Arctic rewarded their optimism just enough to keep it alive. When the ships first entered Lancaster Sound, the water briefly opened up, broad and inviting. It reinforced their belief that this route, at least, was on their side. But the narrowing came gradually. The ice thickened as they pressed west, the floes clustering more densely, the water between them growing dark and oily. They took soundings frequently, the lead line a constant companion, measuring the depths to avoid hidden shoals. The men became experts at moving ice with long poles, pushing smaller floes aside and fending off larger ones. The ship's reinforced bows, designed for this very purpose, proved their worth, shrugging off impacts that would have crippled lesser vessels. Each successful maneuver reinforced their trust in their preparation. Navigation itself became an act of interpretation. Magnetic compasses grew unreliable as the North Pole exerted its powerful influence, forcing them to rely more on landmarks and celestial observation. But clouds and fog often interfered, blurring the horizons into a uniform, disorienting grey. The coast, when it was visible, offered little comfort. It was low, barren, stripped of all vegetation, and its scale was impossible to judge without familiar reference points. Distance itself seemed to warp, compressed one moment and expanded the next by the strange light and the crushing monotony. Progress was measured less in miles than in sheer effort. In this environment, even small decisions took on immense weight, which lead to follow. Each choice shaped the expedition's path, though the true consequences wouldn't be known for years. The officers conferred, constantly balancing caution against their orders. Franklin's presence remained a steadying force, his authority unchallenged. But the Arctic has a way of subtly undermining hierarchy. It imposes its own priorities. Ice does not recognize rank. It responds only to temperature, wind, and time. As the summer wore on, the window for movement began to close. The men watched the ice with growing attention, knowing that the winter freeze-up could arrive suddenly. there was still a current of optimism that a favorable route south would present itself, that Peel Sound would open up and allow them to make decisive progress before being locked in for the winter. The maps suggested it was possible, the ice hinted at resistance, and between these two, the expedition threaded its course, driven by the belief that persistence alone could shape the outcome. By late August, the ships had pushed farther west along this route than anyone before them. It was a genuine achievement that seemed to validate Franklin's confidence. Yet with each hard-won mile, the idea of turning back became less attractive, both practically and psychologically. To retreat would mean admitting that the season had defeated them before the real work had even begun. So instead, they pressed on, always seeking that one opening that would justify the risks they had already taken. The Arctic, for its part, offered no clear refusal, only a tightening grip. The last known position of the Erebus and the Terror lies here, in this narrowing world of ice and water, where direct observation gave way to inference, and certainty dissolved into assumption. From this point forward, their story would have to be reconstructed from fragments, scattered notes, bleached bones, Inuit testimony, and sunken wreckage. But in that moment, for the men on those ships, none of that existed. There was only forward motion, bounded by ice on all sides, and guided by an iron conviction. As the ships passed beyond the edge of the known world, and into a silence that would last for generations, the ice didn't arrive with a sudden, dramatic crash. It was a gradual closing, a slow and silent narrowing of options. The change was so subtle that it only became truly apparent when movement was no longer possible. By early September, the sea ice had thickened, its floes locking together, their edges grinding and crushing until the entire ocean seemed to harden into a single, solid mass. The two ships, Erebus and Terror, were trapped near a small, stony outcrop of land. We know it today as Beachy Island, a bleak, desolate place offering little in the way of shelter, but just enough solid ground to justify stopping. The crews dropped anchor, more out of habit than any real need. The ice itself was the true anchor, holding the ship's hulls in a relentless grip. What had started as a tactical pause, a brief wait for better conditions, quietly and inevitably transformed into the expedition's first long, dark winter. Life aboard the ships changed to accommodate this new reality of immobility. Sails were meticulously furled and secured. The rigging was tightened against the ever-present wind and accumulating frost. Snow had to be cleared from the decks as soon as it fell, the men shoveling in steady, exhausting rotations to prevent a dangerous weight from building up. Below decks, the stoves burned almost constantly. Their warmth was a fragile, precious thing, a delicate counterpoint to the immense cold that pressed in from all sides. As the temperatures plummeted, the ships themselves seemed to protest. The wooden timbers contracted with loud groans, and metal fittings would snap with sharp, rifle-like cracks that echoed through the hull in the dead of night, startling the sleeping men. For many of the crew, this was a completely new experience. A ship was supposed to be a moving refuge, a vessel of exploration. Now, it was a static, isolated outpost in a vast, hostile terrain. The expedition's commander, Sir John Franklin, knew the dangers of idleness as well as the cold. He emphasized strict discipline and constant occupation as the primary defenses against both. Daily routines became formalized and rigid. Ship maintenance, drills, and whenever the brutal weather allowed, vigorous exercise. The men were encouraged to walk on the ice, to expose themselves to the brief daylight and keep their bodies moving, anything to ward off the creeping lethargy of confinement. Religious services were held regularly, the familiar, comforting cadence of prayers offering a psychological shield against the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The ship's library was opened, lectures were scheduled, and preparations were even made for theatrical performances, entertainments that would prove vital to morale in the coming months. Beachy Island itself became a rugged extension of the ships. The men marked out paths across the solid ice, built storehouses on the frozen land, and shaped massive snowbanks into windbreaks to deflect the punishing Arctic gales. They explored their new surroundings cautiously, noting the island's stark barrenness. There were no trees, no animals apart from the occasional bird, nothing to suggest that life could persist here through the winter. It was a place defined by absence, its only value measured by the simple fact that it was solid ground. Yet, that solidity carried a powerful symbolic weight. To winter on land, even this desolate patch of it, felt instinctively safer than drifting helplessly with the unpredictable pack ice. As the weeks bled into one another, the The long Arctic night began its slow, inexorable advance. The sun dipped lower each day, its arc across the sky shrinking until daylight became just a brief, oblique presence, more a suggestion of light than a source of warmth. With the darkness came an intensified bone-chilling cold that seeped through every layer of clothing. Frost formed delicate, crystalline patterns on the inside of the hull, blooming and vanishing with each subtle change in temperature. Below decks, the men's breath hung in the air like smoke, and condensation froze on the beams and bulkheads overhead. They learned to sleep in all their layers, to keep their boots and gloves close by their bodies, lest they freeze into stiff, unusable shapes by morning. It was during this first winter that the expedition suffered its first deaths. 3 men: Petty Officer John Torrington, Royal Marine William Brain, and able seaman John Hartnell fell ill and did not recover. The ship's surgeon recorded their symptoms with clinical, detached restraint: weakness, respiratory distress, and a steady decline. The causes were unclear at the time, attributed simply to pneumonia or general debility, the kind of tragic but expected losses on such a long and arduous voyage. Each death was marked with solemn ceremony. The bodies were carried ashore to Beechey Island, graves were hacked into the permafrost with immense difficulty, and simple wooden headstones were erected, bearing their names and dates of death. The funerals were formal and respectful, conducted with the heavy, unspoken assumption that these 3 men would be the expedition's only casualties. The graves at Beechey Island served a dual purpose. They honored the dead, certainly, but they also served to reassure the living. Death had come, yes, but it had been contained, explained, and ritualized. The expedition continued to function. The leadership remained intact, the supplies were still ample, the ships were secure. In the logic of the moment, these losses didn't signify an impending disaster, but rather the acceptable cost of progress. The Arctic, after all, always demanded its tribute. Medical routines continued. The ship's surgeons diligently monitored the crew's health, prescribing exercise, fresh air, and adjustments to their diet. Lime juice, the standard defense against scurvy, was issued regularly, and the men were encouraged to eat the preserved vegetables, despite their unappealing, mushy texture. The tinned food, though monotonous, was plentiful. There was no immediate sense of hunger, and yet subtle, insidious changes were going unnoticed, or were being misinterpreted. A persistent fatigue settled over the men. They complained of aching joints, and their moods grew irritable. These symptoms were easily explained away, attributed to the oppressive darkness and the close confinement of winter, rather than a more systemic, invisible threat. The winter pressed on, a long and grueling test of patience more than a desperate fight for survival. The ice groaned and creaked around the hulls, occasionally shifting with enough force to jolt the ships violently, sending men scrambling on deck in alarm. Each tremor raised questions about the ice's stability, but it never broke up enough to free them. The men learned to listen for the subtle changes in the sounds around them, to distinguish between the harmless cracking of contracting ice and the dangerous grinding of immense pressure. The long nights were punctuated by these noises, the ice announcing its presence in a language they could not ignore, but did not yet fully understand. Despite the cold and the darkness, life aboard retained elements of normalcy. Christmas was celebrated with as much enthusiasm as they could muster. Extra rations were issued, makeshift decorations were hung, and the theatrical troupe staged their promised performance. Laughter echoed through the lower decks, a fragile but genuine assertion of humanity against the vast, empty void surrounding them. These moments of camaraderie and shared ritual mattered more than the men could possibly articulate. They would later be remembered as proof that morale had once been high, that hope had once been strong. Then, slowly, the sun began to return. At first, its light was weak, offering little warmth, but its presence alone revived hope. The men watched eagerly for the first signs of a thaw, for the subtle softening of the ice that would signal their release. Spring in the Arctic is a deceptive season, offering the promise of freedom without any immediacy. Still, the expectation of escape sustained them. The plan remained unchanged. As soon as the ice loosened its grip, they would push south and west, deeper into the maze of the Northwest Passage. They would leave Beechey Island behind, a temporary refuge, a mere marker of their endurance, not a warning of what was to come. When the ships finally broke free from the ice that summer, the 3 graves remained on the shore, small interruptions in an otherwise untouched landscape. At the time, they seemed insignificant, little more than footnotes in a grand story of heroic progress. No one could have imagined that they would become the expedition's most articulate and haunting witnesses, their perfect preservation in the permafrost allowing future generations to read the tragic story that the living could not. For now, the men of the Erebus and Terror turned their attention forward, towards the unexplored passage ahead, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that the Arctic had already claimed its first due. For the crews of the Erebus and Terror, release from the ice was not a sudden liberation. It was a slow, tense negotiation. The pack ice loosened its grip reluctantly, opening narrow, shifting leads of water that demanded constant vigilance. When the ships finally moved again, it was with a caution born from months spent listening to the ice's every groan and crack. The men worked the ships through openings that could appear and vanish in the same day, advancing mere yards at a time. Sometimes they had to stop completely, waiting for conditions to change. But any movement, no matter how slow, was a relief. It revived spirits that had been crushed by the long, stagnant winter. Progress, however small, restored the sense of purpose that the darkness had eroded. With this newfound momentum, a critical question resurfaced. Which route south would lead to the legendary Northwest Passage? To the north lay the Wellington Channel, broad and tempting. But Sir John Franklin's orders prioritized a more southerly route if possible, one that might connect directly with known waters. That southern option was Peel Sound. It was narrow, and reports from earlier explorers suggested it was often choked with ice. But often was not always. The summer of 1846 presented an opportunity, a calculated gamble shaped by imperial expectation and personal legacy. To turn north into Wellington Channel risked another winter in the ice with no guarantee of success. But to push south through Peel Sound promised decisive progress, the kind that would justify the entire expedition. The ice looked marginally favorable, and in the high-stakes game of Arctic exploration, a marginal advantage carried immense weight. The decision was made. The ships turned south, committing themselves to a narrowing corridor with little room to turn back. As they entered the Sound, the environment changed. The ice pressed closer, the water grew darker and colder, its currents less predictable. The low, austere land on either side loomed nearer, offering no shelter from the wind. Progress slowed even more. The ships began to rely heavily on their steam engines, burning through irreplaceable coal. Every hour the engines ran was a trade-off, immediate movement in exchange for future vulnerability. The men could feel the stakes rising. Summer in the Arctic is brutally short, and its brevity was becoming all too apparent. The sun, though still high in the sky, lacked the warmth to break the ice decisively. Leads closed more often than they opened. Massive pressure ridges of ice formed with alarming speed. The ships were forced to retreat from promising channels as huge floes converged, their hulls scraping and shuddering under the immense strain. The officers gathered frequently, their options diminishing with each passing day. The Sound that had once seemed a gateway now felt more like a trap. By late summer, it was clear the gamble had failed. The ice tightened its grip once more, sealing the ships in a position far more perilous than their first winter anchorage at Beechy Island. There was no nearby harbor, no solid land for shelter, only a shifting, grinding plain of ice stretching to the horizon. The anchors were dropped, but they were purely symbolic. The ships were held fast by a power far beyond human command. The realization settled slowly, but heavily. They were facing another winter, this time deeper in the Arctic, with far fewer margins for error. Preparations for the winter began again, but the optimism was gone. The men had learned from their first winter, but no amount of learning could guarantee safety. Supplies were still ample, but the psychological toll was mounting. This was no longer a temporary halt on the edge of the known world. They were now trapped in a region from which escape would be exponentially harder. On the maps in the officers' mess, their position was a tiny mark surrounded by a vast, empty whiteness. As the temperature plummeted, the ice around the ships grew thicker, more hostile. Towering pressure ridges rose nearby, silent monuments to the immense forces at work beneath the surface. The men worked to reinforce the hulls, bracing beams and securing stores against any sudden, violent movement of the ice. Every creak and groan from the pack sent a jolt of alertness through the crew. Sleep became a luxury, punctuated by the need to check the lines and listen for the telltale sounds of danger. The leadership felt the strain. Franklin's authority was still intact, but the expedition's confidence had been severely shaken. The men trusted his experience, but it was becoming clear that endurance alone might not be enough. Within the command structure, the tension between Captain Crozier's stark realism and Commander Fitzjames's relentless energy grew. Decisions were still made according to strict naval protocol, but protocol seemed increasingly inadequate for the sheer complexity of their situation. The second winter descended with a harsher tone. The darkness returned earlier, the cold deepened faster, and the sense of isolation became suffocating. This time, there was no land to walk on, only the unstable ice shifting beneath their feet. The ships became self-contained worlds, their interiors growing more crowded as the men huddled together for warmth and familiarity. They maintained their social rituals, plays, classes, songs, but the laughter was strained, edged with fatigue. It was during this period that subtle, grim changes began to accelerate. Sickness spread more easily in the cramped, confined quarters. Minor injuries healed slowly, if at all. Tempers grew short. The preserved food, once a symbol of security, became a source of monotony and suspicion, as tins were opened to reveal spoilt or unappetizing contents. Yet, there was no open panic. These were men of the Royal Navy, trained to endure, and endure they did, even as the Arctic tested the absolute limits of their preparation and resolve. The gamble on Peel Sound had irrevocably altered their fate. What had been a bold push for glory had now become a constraint on every future decision. The ships sat locked in ice that showed no sign of releasing them, their crews bound to a course set months earlier, under entirely different assumptions. As the second winter deepened, the Arctic closed around the Erebus in terror, with a finality that was felt more than it was spoken. The men continued their routines, maintained their logs, and followed their orders. But beneath it all lay an unspoken awareness. They had crossed a threshold. The ice was no longer an obstacle on the path to discovery. It had become the very condition of their existence, reshaping their grand purpose into a desperate struggle for mere persistence. The second winter didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It crept in quietly, settling over the Franklin expedition like a sickness you don't realize is serious until the fever just won't break. The cold was different this time, more intense than anything they'd experienced the first year. It wasn't just the plunging temperatures, it was the duration. The darkness seemed to cling on for dear life, and when the daylight finally returned, it was a weak, pale version of its former self. Just surviving became a monumental effort. The ships, Erebus and Terror, were trapped, held fast in ice that had no intention of letting go. They became sealed worlds, where every single weakness, whether in the wood and iron or in the men themselves, was put under a microscope. Down below decks, the air turned stale and thick. No matter how hard they tried to ventilate, it was a losing battle. The sharp smell of coal smoke mingled with the damp rot of wood, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the lingering odor of preserved foods. Condensation would freeze on the beams above their heads, then drip back down as the temperature shifted slightly, coating every surface in a thin, treacherous layer of ice. Nothing ever truly dried. Clothes were perpetually damp. Boots would freeze solid overnight. Men's fingers would crack and bleed from the constant, biting cold. At first, these were just irritations, minor annoyances, but soon, they became daily, painful reminders that any semblance of comfort was now just a distant memory. Then, the men's health started to decline in ways their doctors just couldn't explain. They were plagued by a deep, persistent fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. Their limbs ached, their joints swelled up, gums started to bleed, teeth loosened in their sockets, and old half-healed wounds mysteriously reopened. Scurvy, but it crept back silently, exploiting the slow degradation of vitamins in their preserved supplies. The doctors ordered more rations and forced the men to exercise on the frozen decks, but it did little to nothing. The sickness had taken hold, but there was something else, something far more sinister at play, a gradual poisoning that nobody even recognized. The tinned food, their symbol of modern, reliable preservation, held a dark secret. The cans were sealed with lead solder, and it was poorly done. With every single meal, tiny imperceptible amounts of lead were leaching into the food, and the men were ingesting it. The lead slowly accumulated in their bodies, and the symptoms began to show: confusion, sudden irritability, crippling weakness, and terrible stomach pains. But in the brutal environment of the Arctic, these signs were easily mistaken for something else: the effects of the cold, the stress, the general exhaustion of their situation. They trusted their technology, their state-of-the-art provisions, and that blind trust was slowly killing them. As their bodies weakened, their minds began to fray. The profound, crushing silence of the Arctic pressed in on them. The only sounds were the groans and creaks of the ice pack shifting, or the low hum of life aboard the ships. Conversations turned inward, becoming repetitive loops of the same old stories, told over and over until they lost all meaning. Some men withdrew completely, becoming silent ghosts. Others became argumentative, picking fights over the smallest things. Discipline became harder to maintain, not because of any outright rebellion, but because sheer exhaustion was eroding their will to obey. The leaders felt this pressure more than anyone. Sir John Franklin, the expedition's commander, tried to remain a steady presence. He maintained his formal routines, keeping up appearances, but his age and his own failing health were becoming obvious. The immense burden of command was clearly weighing him down as his options dwindled to nothing. Captain Crozier, a pragmatic and seasoned Arctic veteran, knew exactly what another year stuck in the ice meant. He understood the terrifying implications, and Captain Fitzjames, ever the optimist, worked tirelessly to keep morale from completely collapsing. But even his cheerful energy was beginning to show cracks. The ships themselves looked like they were suffering. Their hulls were scarred and dented from the immense pressure of the ice. Beams creaked and groaned under the constant stress. Maintenance became a full-time, desperate job, just to keep the ships from falling apart around them. The men spent endless, grueling hours chipping away ice, reinforcing bulkheads, and checking pumps that were constantly struggling against the freezing water. Every single task took longer, demanded more energy, and offered less and less satisfaction. The exciting sense of exploration, of pushing toward a goal, was gone. It was replaced by the monotonous, repetitive labor of just trying to hold on. Even food, their source of life, became a psychological burden. The sheer monotony of preserved meat and hard biscuits destroyed their appetites. Sometimes, they'd pry open a can only to find the contents discolored and foul-smelling. It planted seeds of doubt and fear, but hunger always won out. There was no fresh meat. The vast, empty ice desert around them was devoid of life, so they ate. They ate because they had to, not because they wanted to. Mealtimes lost their social warmth and became joyless moments of refueling. Sickness spread through the crews, but it was unpredictable. Some men would deteriorate with terrifying speed, while others seemed almost untouched. This randomness made it worse, undermining any confidence they had left in their doctors. Death wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a lingering possibility, a shadow that hovered at the edge of every daily routine. Every cough, every man who fainted at his post, brought the unspoken question to everyone's mind. Who's next? And is there anything at all we can do? They continued to keep their records. The ship's logs noted the temperature, the ice conditions, the daily duties, but the entries grew shorter, more sterile. They didn't capture the fear, the doubt, the gnawing anxiety. That wasn't the way of the British Navy. Their records were for facts, not feelings. But that very absence, that silence in the official account, speaks volumes about the strain they were under. And the Arctic offered no mercy. Blizzards would sweep across the ice, burying everything in a sea of white. The wind howled against the ships, a relentless scream that seemed to vibrate right through their bones. Sometimes, the ice pressure would increase suddenly, forcing the men onto the deck in the pitch-black, freezing night to saw at the ice, their breath freezing in their beards as they worked by the flickering light of lanterns. These moments were stark reminders of just how fragile their existence was. They were in a constant battle against forces that never got tired. Slowly, a sense of decay settled over the entire expedition. It wasn't outright despair, not yet. It was more like a slow erosion. The blazing optimism that had fueled their journey south was gone, replaced by a single, narrow objective: get through the winter alive. The Northwest Passage, discovery, glory, all of it, faded into abstraction. Their world shrank to the immediate, the task at hand, the gnawing discomfort, the next meal. It was in this environment that the expedition's spirit began to unravel. There was no mutiny, no open conflict. It was a quiet, internal collapse. The core belief that had sustained them, that proper planning and technology guaranteed success, had been shattered. The Arctic had shown them the absolute limits of human endurance. Yet, what else could they do? The ships were trapped. Rescue was a fantasy. The only strategy left was to persist. By the time the worst of that second winter was over, the men were diminished. Their bodies were weaker, their minds dulled. The expedition was still functioning, but it was a shadow of its former self. They followed orders, they maintained the ships, but the confidence that had once powered every decision was gone. Something fundamental had shifted inside them. They now understood that their survival was no longer in their hands. It was contingent, subject to forces beyond their control. This silent decay wasn't the end, but it was preparing the way for it. Every day, the men rose, worked, ate, and slept. Their resilience stretched thinner and thinner. The ice remained, unmoved, indifferent to their struggle, to their hope. And trapped within that frozen stillness, the Franklin expedition carried on, tragically unaware of how much strength they had already lost, and how little they had left to face what was coming next. The death of Sir John Franklin was not a grand, ceremonial affair. There were no last words for the history books, no dramatic final scene. It was a quiet, almost incidental event, noted down later, its true, shattering significance only understood in hindsight. Sometime in June of 1847, after nearly 2 years trapped in the relentless Arctic ice, the commander of the expedition died. The official cause was never really documented, but it's easy to guess: illness, exhaustion, old age, and the slow, insidious poisons like lead that were already seeping into the men from their tinned food. But how he died wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was the vacuum he left behind. Franklin was more than just the captain. He was the symbolic heart of the entire venture. His very presence was a constant reassurance to the crew. It meant that no matter how grim things got, they were still under the protection of the Royal Navy, still part of a grand imperial mission. When he died, that assurance evaporated. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier. Crozier was a deeply experienced polar explorer, arguably more qualified for the Arctic than Franklin himself. But his temperament was different. He was a cautious man, a realist who understood the limits of what was possible in this brutal landscape. The shift in leadership was a turning point, not because Crozier was a weaker commander, but because reality had finally crushed optimism. Crozier inherited a disaster in the making. The ships, Erebus and Terror, were still locked solid in the ice. The men were growing weaker by the day. Their supplies, while not gone, were diminishing in quality and were likely contaminated. He faced a terrible choice with no good options. Should they wait, clinging to the hope that the ice would break up and free the ships, a hope that might never be realized? Or should they attempt a desperate retreat on foot across hundreds of miles of frozen sea and barren land that few, if any, Europeans had ever successfully traversed? Franklin's steadfast authority had postponed this terrible decision. His death forced it to the forefront. The expedition could no longer just endure and wait. Morale began to splinter. Some men clung to the familiar naval routines as if their lives depended on it, believing that strict discipline was the only thing that could save them. Others began to sense that the old rules no longer applied. They understood that survival might mean abandoning everything they knew, including the very structure of their command. This wasn't an open mutiny, but you could feel it in the hesitation, in the quiet erosion of the unity that had once guided every action. Orders were still followed, but the blind confidence that made obedience feel natural was gone. The officers had to walk a razor's edge. How to communicate the terrifying reality of their situation without causing mass panic? They had to formally announce Franklin's death, completely reevaluate their plans, and somehow hold together a crew of over 100 men who were already strained to their absolute limits. Crozier's leadership style was a stark contrast to Franklin's formal top-down approach. He favored pragmatism and consultation. Decisions were now openly debated among the senior officers, a clear sign that they needed collective judgment now that their commanding symbol was gone. The environment offered no comfort. The summer of 1847 came and went, but the ice remained a solid, unbroken field. It defied all their hopes and expectations of a thaw. Occasionally, small channels of open water, known as leads, would appear, teasing them with the possibility of escape. But just as quickly, the ice would grind shut again, with a crushing finality. Each failed hope, each day that passed, reinforced the growing dread that waiting any longer would only seal their fate. Time, which had once been the ally of their patience, had now become their greatest enemy. It was during this period of dawning horror that the expedition's most famous written record was created. A brief, stark note was left in a stone cairn, a message in a bottle for a frozen ocean. It summarized their situation with chilling brevity. The ships had been trapped since September 1846. Franklin was dead. Crozier was now in command. They planned to abandon the ships and march south. The tone is purely factual, completely stripped of emotion. But between those few lines lies a monumental admission of defeat. The mission was over. The Northwest Passage would not be conquered by the crews of the Erebus and Terror. The decision to abandon the ships was not made lightly. A ship in the Arctic isn't just a vehicle. It's your home, your fortress, your supply depot, and a powerful psychological anchor. To leave them behind meant severing the last physical link to the world they knew, to the entire structure of the Royal Navy, and to any realistic hope of rescue by sea. But staying aboard was a death sentence. The men were getting sicker, the scurvy was getting worse, and the ice showed no signs of releasing its grip. Crozier and his officers made the only choice they could. Survival meant they had to move, even if that movement was into a different kind of danger. Preparations for the march began. They inventoried supplies, making agonizing decisions about what to take and what to leave. Every ounce mattered. They ingeniously fitted the ship's boats with runners, turning them into heavy, cumbersome sledges they would have to haul by hand. The men began practice runs, dragging these monstrously heavy loads across the rough, uneven ice. They discovered very quickly just how punishing the effort would be for bodies already weakened by malnutrition and illness. Each practice haul was a brutal preview of the ordeal to come. Franklin's death echoed through all these desperate preparations. Without his symbolic leadership, the expedition's very identity had changed. They were no longer explorers on a grand quest for discovery. They were survivors, trying to escape through a rapidly narrowing corridor of possibility. For men who had signed on with dreams of glory, fame, and a triumphant return, this was a difficult, bitter pill to swallow. To be reduced to this marching south on foot, hauling their own lifeboats, felt less like a strategic retreat and more like a final, humiliating surrender. Discipline became a strange and complex thing. But the officers also had to be pragmatic. They couldn't push men who were at their physical breaking point. Punishment for minor mistakes was quietly replaced with a kind of weary tolerance. Survival now depended on cooperation, not just on rigid adherence to the naval code. This wasn't a moral decay. It was a necessary adaptation, an unwritten but essential change in the expedition's culture. The timing of Franklin's death was especially cruel. It happened at a moment when the hope of the ice breaking up hadn't completely died. His death felt like a door slamming shut, a narrowing of their chances. If he had lived to see another summer, maybe his authority could have guided them down a different path. Instead, his death coincided with the Arctic's final, unyielding refusal to let them go, forever tying his legacy to the expedition's tragic unraveling, not its success. As the day to abandon the ships grew closer, the men moved through the familiar decks of the Erebus and Terror with a haunting new awareness. The cabins, the mess decks, the workrooms, places that had once represented the continuity of their lives, now felt like ghost ships. They were temporary spaces, soon to be left to the ice and the silence. Every object was re-evaluated. Was it useful enough to carry? Personal belongings were cast aside. Cherished mementos weighed against the life or death value of an extra ration of food or a tool. The ships, still solid, still seaworthy under the ice, were becoming relics even before their crews had left. The shift in command wasn't a collapse, it was a fundamental transformation. Leadership was no longer about representing the ambitions of an empire, it was about managing attrition. Crozier's task was not to complete a map, but to try and lead as many men as he could out of a situation that offered no hope of victory. In this grim, recalibrated world, Sir John Franklin's death marked the end of one story, the story of glorious exploration and the beginning of a new one. A story defined not by achievement but by pure human endurance, stripped of all its illusions. In the biting cold of April 1848, the world of the Franklin expedition shrank to the frozen sea ice beside two trapped ships, Erebus and Terror. For nearly 3 years, these vessels had been their home, their fortress against the Arctic. But now, with the ice showing no sign of releasing its grip, a desperate decision was made. This wasn't a mutiny or a desertion. It was a calculated gamble for survival. The men, 105 of them, assembled on the ice. They were stepping away from the only world they knew, trading the relative safety of the ships for the brutal uncertainty of the land. The plan hinged on brute force. Heavy lifeboats, loaded onto massive sledges, were packed with everything they thought they'd need. Tins of food, rifles, cooking pots, and precious navigational instruments. The weight was crushing. Men strapped themselves into harnesses, leaning into the task like beasts of burden, their boots struggling for purchase on the wind-polished ice. Progress was a slow, agonizing crawl. The cold was a physical enemy, seeping into any exposed skin. While sweat froze against their bodies, adding a chilling dampness to their exhaustion. Their destination was a line on a map, the mouth of the Back River, hundreds of miles to the south. Captain Crozier believed this waterway could be their escape route, leading them back to the Canadian mainland and the familiar world of trading posts. On paper, it seemed logical, even hopeful. But the reality of the Arctic landscape was a different story. The terrain was a nightmare, shifting between jagged, uneven sea ice and barren, rocky shores that tore at their boots and shredded the wooden runners of the sledges. Every transition from ice to land and back again was a major operation, consuming precious time and energy. The rigid naval hierarchy that had governed their lives for years began to dissolve under the shared strain. Officers and sailors hauled side by side, their ranks erased by the sheer physical exertion. Orders became less about command and more about coordination, dictated by the immediate, desperate needs of the moment. When a man stumbled, others would help him up, but every act of support taxed the group's dwindling energy. The pace of the entire column was dictated by its weakest members, a grim arithmetic that forced them to constantly recalculate their chances against the diminishing rations and collapsing morale. The physical toll was devastating and swift. Scurvy, the old ghost of long sea voyages, returned with a vengeance. It softened their gums, weakened their muscles, and made every single step a torment of willpower. Compounding this was the silent poison they'd been consuming for years. Lead, leaching from the poorly sodded tins of their food, was clouding their minds, making complex navigation and critical decision-making nearly impossible. Frostbite was a constant threat, stealthily claiming fingers and toes, the damage often done before the men even realized it. Yet, they pushed on. To stop was to die. Moving forward, no matter how slowly, became their only purpose, a moral imperative against the encroaching despair. As the days bled into one another, the heavy sledges became monuments to their fading hopes. The men began to shed the very things they once considered essential. Books, spare uniforms, even valuable scientific instruments were cast aside, left behind on the ice to lighten the unbearable loads. The most painful sacrifices were the personal ones. A letter from a wife, a service medal, a small keepsake from home. Each item was weighed, its sentimental value measured against its physical burden, and then abandoned. It was more than just lightening a sledge. It was a stripping away of identity, paring themselves down to the raw essence of survival. The landscape itself offered no solace. The Arctic spring brought a blinding, brilliant light that reflected off the endless ice, creating sharp, dark shadows. The silence was immense, broken only by the howling wind and the grating scrape of the sledges. They were starving. The promised game was nowhere to be found, and the few animals they did see were gone before a shot could be fired. The rations, already insufficient for the grueling work, were being consumed far too quickly. Their bodies were eating themselves from the inside out. At some point along this death march, a critical decision was made. One of the heavy lifeboats, their supposed vessel of salvation, was abandoned. Search parties years later would find it, perched bizarrely on its sledge far from any open water, filled with a strange collection of items, including silk handkerchiefs and slippers. At the time, leaving it behind was a desperate compromise, an admission that their strength was failing faster than their plan allowed. It was a haunting symbol of hope, giving way to harsh reality. Death became a quiet companion on the trail. Men would falter, sit down to rest, and simply never get up again. In the frozen ground, proper burials were impossible. The living lacked the time, the tools, and the strength for ceremony. A body would be covered with a few stones or a mound of snow, and the column would march on, leaving their comrades behind. Each loss was a blow, shrinking their collective margin for survival and increasing the physical and psychological load on those who remained. There was no time to grieve. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. All emotion was channeled into the next step, and the next. The Back River, their beacon of hope, remained stubbornly out of reach. It was farther than the map suggested, and even if they reached it, there was no guarantee it would be navigable. Its currents and ice were just as treacherous as the land they were crossing, but it was the only goal they had. Without that line on the map, their organized retreat would dissolve into aimless wandering. They were not entirely alone. There were occasional, fleeting encounters with local Inuit groups, but a vast cultural gulf, mutual suspicion, and the sailors' rapidly deteriorating condition prevented any meaningful help. The British were conditioned to rely on their own technology and authority, which made it difficult for them to adapt or accept the survival strategies honed by the Inuit over centuries. Any aid they received was temporary and insufficient to change their tragic course. As weeks stretched into a month, then too, the organized march south disintegrated. The single column of men fractured into smaller, desperate groups. Some may have split off intentionally, hoping to increase the odds that someone might survive. Others were simply left behind as they grew too weak to keep up. Communication failed, command collapsed, and the Franklin expedition, as a unified entity, ceased to exist. All that remained were scattered individuals and small bands of men, each fighting their own losing battle against the Arctic. The moment they stepped off the Erebus in terror, they had cut their last tie to the world they knew. On the ice, stripped of their technology, shelter, and supplies, they faced the raw, unforgiving power of the North. The long march south became the final, brutal chapter of their story, a testament to the limits of human endurance and the terrible cost of underestimating the Arctic. Every step took them further from their frozen ships and deeper into a beautiful, desolate landscape that offered no rescue, only the relentless choice to keep moving or to finally collapse. The southward march wasn't one single, epic disaster. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing disintegration, a story told in scattered fragments across the ice and frozen land. What began as shortages became a constant, gnawing void. Supplies vanished. The endless effort of just moving drained every last bit of strength. Bodies, already weakened, started to fail. The men wasted away, their muscles disappearing beneath clothes that now hung on them like sacks. Progress slowed, then stuttered, then stopped. The Arctic didn't need to be aggressive. Its sheer, unyielding harshness was enough. Finding food became an act of desperate improvisation. Hunting attempts were rare and almost never successful. These men were sailors, not Arctic hunters. They didn't know the land, its rhythms, or its secrets. Sickness had dulled their reflexes. Sometimes they'd get a small animal or a bird, but it was never enough to feed the group. More often than not, the energy they spent trying to get food was more than the food itself provided. Each attempt was a losing gamble. Hunger became their new reality. It shaped every thought, every action, and destroyed their morale. As the deprivation got worse, the men faced choices that would have once been unimaginable. Early in the expedition, when a man died, he was buried with full naval honors. But as more men died and the living grew weaker, the old traditions lost their meaning. The dead were no longer just a loss. They became a potential source of life for the others. Later findings strongly suggest that the remains of the fallen were carefully used to prolong the survival of the living. This wasn't a sudden, impulsive act of madness. It was the grim, logical outcome of prolonged, extreme necessity. There were simply no other options left. The psychological weight of this must have been immense. In Victorian Britain, cannibalism was the ultimate taboo, an absolute moral line you did not cross. It was something they associated with savage societies, far removed from their own civilized world. For these men, raised with that belief system, crossing that line would have been a profound violation of their very identity. But extreme starvation doesn't care about moral debates. The primal instinct to live, to see one more sunrise, gradually overpowered principles that had once seemed unbreakable. Decades later, Inuit hunters shared their stories. They spoke of seeing a handful of white men, their faces skeletal, their movements strained, trying to drag a heavy boat over land. They described campsites with strange, unsettling traces left behind, and they talked about seeing human bodies that had been treated in ways completely foreign to their own customs. At first, these reports were dismissed in Britain. They were chalked up to prejudice or misunderstanding. It was only when physical evidence started to pile up that the grim consistency of these accounts was finally acknowledged. Human bones, recovered from the desolate landscape, told the unvarnished truth. They bore clear, undeniable marks of deliberate butchery. Cut marks at the joints and specific patterns of fracture showed this was not the work of animals or the natural process of decay. These findings turned rumor into documented fact. The final, horrifying chapter of the Franklin expedition was no longer speculation. The men had resorted to the last taboo to survive. It's hard for us to even imagine their mental state during this time. Severe starvation changes how you think. It warps your perception, erodes your self-control, and narrows your entire world down to one thing: the immediate, desperate need for food. Under those conditions, teamwork falls apart. It became a scattered collection of individuals, each one pushing the absolute limits of human endurance. Bonds of friendship probably held on for as long as they could, but they were fragile, dependent on a shared ability to keep moving, not a shared purpose. The losses likely came one after another, each death increasing the burden on those who remained. At some point, carrying the sick and the dying would have become impossible. The decision to leave a man behind, someone unable to walk any further, would have been a silent one. A terrible, unspoken agreement with irreversible consequences. The placement of some remains, found alone, far from the others, suggests these agonizing moments where separation and survival became the same thing. The environment itself conspired against them. The seasons changed, but brought no relief. As the ice melted, the frozen highways they had used turned into impassable slush and swollen rivers. The warmer weather brought swarms of biting insects and the stench of decay, but no new sources of food. Rivers that were once frozen solid now blocked their path, forcing them on long, exhausting detours that burned precious calories they didn't have. The landscape itself seemed to actively resist their every step. The boats, once their symbols of hope and escape, became dead weight. Some were just abandoned, left intact like strange monuments in the middle of nowhere. Others were broken down, stripped for wood and materials. The sight of these seafaring vessels, stranded hundreds of miles inland, would later become one of the most haunting images of the entire tragedy. For the men at the time, they were simply markers of a plan that had completely collapsed in the face of an unforgiving reality. Inuit people traveling through the region saw the wreckage of the expedition. They saw the abandoned gear and the skeletal men. With generations of Arctic experience, they recognized the signs of a final, irreversible collapse, signs the Europeans themselves may not have fully understood. But what could they do? Language barriers, a lack of their own surplus resources, and the sheer scale of the disaster limited what help they could offer. Cultural misunderstandings also played a role, preventing aid from being effectively given or accepted. By the time the last man died, the Franklin expedition existed only as a ghost, a trail of scattered clues. A few lonely campsites, isolated human remains, a tool dropped in the snow, a piece of clothing left where its owner's strength finally failed. There was no single, dramatic final moment. The Franklin expedition didn't end. It just dissolved, absorbed back into the land that had resisted it from the very beginning. The evidence of cannibalism shocked Victorian society. It wasn't because they were unfamiliar with hardship. It was because it shattered their core belief that they were somehow morally exceptional. The Arctic had forced proud British sailors into a situation they believed only existed in the primitive world, collapsing the comfortable distinction between civilized and savage that was a pillar of their imperial confidence. In that sense, the end of the expedition wasn't just a tragedy, it was profoundly unsettling. And what remained was silence. A silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the groan of shifting ice. The men who had set sail from England full of pomp and confidence were gone. Their final story wasn't written in official reports or ship's logs. It was written in cut marks on bone and in the hushed testimony of Inuit hunters. The Arctic hadn't just defeated them, it had dissolved the very framework through which their world understood defeat. When the Franklin expedition fell silent, no one panicked. In the vast icy expanse of the Arctic, silence was normal. Communication was dictated by the seasons, and a year or two without word was just part of the rhythm. Absence was interpreted as delay, not disaster. But as years turned into a long, quiet wait, concern slowly hardened into alarm. And with that alarm came one of the most obsessive, sprawling search efforts in maritime history. This wasn't just about finding lost sailors. It was about national pride, private grief, and a desperate need for answers. The first search parties sailed with hope in their hearts. They operated under the assumption that Sir John Franklin and his 128 men were alive somewhere, waiting for the ice to release their ships, the HMS Erebus and Terror, or perhaps even living among the local Inuit communities. Captains were ordered to scan coastlines for smoke, to leave caches of supplies, and to look for any sign of movement. Each expedition that returned empty-handed still brought something back. They added fragments to the map of the Arctic, charting new coastlines and naming unknown channels. The Arctic, it seemed, was more willing to give up its geography than its truths. But back in England, one person refused to let the search die: Jane Franklin. Franklin's wife was a force of nature, politically sharp and absolutely relentless. She masterfully used public sympathy and her own high society connections to keep the search going long after the British Admiralty had lost its enthusiasm. Every year that passed without news only deepened the mystery, turning a failed voyage into a national obsession. As the searchers pushed farther and farther south, the things they found began to change. Instead of finding signals or intact campsites, they started encountering objects: a single boot, a scrap of uniform cloth, a piece of metal worked into an unfamiliar shape. These small, lonely items hinted at a story very different from the official narrative. They suggested the men hadn't stayed with their ships, but had been moving, desperate and on foot. The Arctic, once imagined as an empty stage for a heroic rescue, was slowly revealing itself as a vast, frozen archive of abandonment and despair. The most significant breakthrough didn't come from the Royal Navy, it came from the Inuit. For years, local hunters and families had been sharing stories. They spoke of encounters with starving white men, dragging heavy boats across the ice. They told of ships crushed by the relentless pressure of the pack ice, and of bodies found scattered inland, far from the coast. These oral histories, passed down through generations, offered a chillingly clear picture of the expedition's end. At first, British explorers and officials dismissed these accounts. They were filtered through a lens of prejudice, viewed as unreliable or exaggerated stories from savages. But then, the physical evidence began to line up perfectly with what the Inuit had been saying all along. Suddenly, their words held undeniable weight. Search parties, now guided by this local knowledge, began to find human remains along the desolate coast of King William Island. Skeletons lay where men had fallen, sometimes in small, tragic clusters, sometimes alone. Their positions suggested not a battle or a sudden accident, but a slow, grinding collapse from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. And scattered around them were the things they could no longer carry: silverware, scientific instruments, even books. Objects too heavy to haul but too familiar to leave behind until the very last moment. Each discovery added a new, heartbreaking detail, reframing the end of the Franklin expedition as a long, slow, agonizing retreat. Then, they found the note. Tucked into a stone cairn, a single piece of paper provided the only official voice from the final, doomed phase of the expedition. Its words were brief and stark. Ships beset by ice for over a year. Franklin is dead. The remaining crew plans to abandon the ships and walk south. In just a few lines, the grand ambition of the expedition was reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. The note answered some questions but left gaping holes in the narrative, forcing everyone to imagine the horror that unfolded in the spaces between those facts. With the hope of rescue gone, the search transformed into a mission of reconstruction. The goal was no longer to save the men, but to understand exactly what had happened to them. This shift allowed for darker possibilities to be considered. The Inuit stories of cannibalism, once furiously dismissed, were re-examined. New skeletal evidence, showing cut marks on human bones, seemed to corroborate the unthinkable. The searchers themselves had to grapple with this horrifying reality, knowing that confirming it would shatter long-held beliefs about British discipline and moral superiority in the face of adversity. The process of piecing together the tragedy was slow and emotionally charged. Some expeditions focused on giving the dead a proper burial, reinterring remains, and trying to maintain a sense of decorum. Others meticulously documented every single find, recognizing that the unvarnished truth, however unsettling, was the expedition's final, most important legacy. Each bone examined, each artifact catalogued, added more texture to a story that simply refused to resolve itself into a neat, clean conclusion. By the late 1800s, a broad outline of the disaster had emerged. The ships, Erebus and Terror, had become trapped in the ice. The men had waited, holding out hope for a thaw that never came. Then, they walked. They marched south, growing weaker and weaker, until their group fragmented, and they died, one by one, along the way. But so much remained unknown. The individual stories, the key decisions, the moments of conflict or compassion were lost to time. The Arctic preserved bodies and objects, but it had erased their voices, leaving historians to guess at their final thoughts and actions. The Franklin expedition became a ghost story, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of naval lore and the popular imagination. It exposed the brutal limits of technology and preparation, and the profound danger of projecting human certainty onto an environment that is utterly indifferent to our plans. It also revealed the tragic cost of dismissing indigenous knowledge. of valuing imperial procedure over local wisdom and adaptation. In their quest for answers, the searchers forever changed the Arctic landscape they explored. They left behind new names on maps, stone cairns marking discoveries, and graves for the fallen. The region became a palimpsest canvas, written over with layers of ambition and aftermath. Its geography now inseparable from the story of the men who vanished within it. And yet, for all the effort, the horror of what happened was never fully contained. For over a century and a half, each new discovery only seemed to raise new questions. Each answer revealed deeper, more unsettling uncertainties. The search didn't end the story of the Franklin expedition. It extended it, transforming a tragic loss into an enduring and fascinating global inquiry. The men of the Erebus and Terror remain absent, but their fate, once a silent mystery, has become an unavoidable, unforgettable testament to the true cost of exploration. For over 150 years, one of the greatest mysteries in the history of exploration lay frozen in time. The Franklin expedition, with its two advanced ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sailed into the Arctic in 1845, searching for the Northwest Passage, and simply vanished. The 129 men aboard were never seen again. Their absence became a void filled with speculation. Were the ships crushed by ice? Did they drift for hundreds of miles? Ghost ships in a frozen wasteland? The expedition became a symbol of noble failure, a story of heroic sacrifice against the unforgiving elements. But then, in the 21st century, the Arctic finally gave up its secrets. In 2014, the wreck of the Erebus was found, sitting upright on the seabed, eerily intact. 2 years later, the Terror was located in even more astonishing condition. Its windows were unbroken, its interior spaces still recognizable, as if the crew had just stepped away. The same cold that had doomed the men had also perfectly preserved their ships, turning them into ghost-like time capsules. These discoveries didn't completely rewrite the story, but they sharpened its focus with hard, physical truth. The ships hadn't been instantly destroyed in some cataclysmic event. They had survived long after the crew abandoned them, drifting silently to their final resting places. Details began to emerge from the wrecks. We saw closed hatches and neatly organized interiors. This wasn't a scene of chaos and panic. The men had left their ships methodically, following naval procedure to the letter, even as that discipline could no longer save them from starvation and the crushing cold. What the wrecks gave us in material certainty, however, they lacked in personal narrative. They answered the question of asterisk, where asterisk the ships ended up, but not the deeper questions of asterisk why asterisk everything went so wrong. Objects were found exactly where human hands had placed them, but the hands and the stories they could tell were gone forever. No logbooks were discovered to chronicle those final desperate months. No sealed letters to loved ones. The ships spoke volumes through their silence, their pristine condition highlighting the immense human loss that could never be recovered. For generations, the Inuit people of the region had passed down stories of seeing the starving sailors and finding their camps. They told of where the ships had gone down, but for a century and a half, their oral histories were dismissed by Western authorities. The discovery of the wrecks, exactly where Inuit knowledge said they would be, was a powerful and long overdue validation. It proved that the land had been speaking all along through the people who knew it best, and that a tragic price was paid for ignoring their perspective. The Franklin story isn't just about a European failure, it's a stark reminder of the cost of cultural arrogance. In Britain, the loss of the expedition forced a reckoning. The belief in imperial dominance and technological superiority was shaken. The Arctic was no longer just a blank space on a map waiting to be conquered. It was a powerful entity in its own right, with the ability to refuse entry. Exploration narratives after Franklin began to change, slowly incorporating a new sense of humility and a respect for the unpredictable nature of the wild. Over the years, public memory shaped the expedition into a myth. Statues were erected depicting Captain Sir John Franklin as a triumphant hero, not a man leading his crew to a grim end. The narrative of noble sacrifice was a way to soften the horrific truths of starvation, scurvy, and even cannibalism that later came to light. It was easier to digest a story of martyrdom than to confront the full, brutal reality of the expedition's collapse. But the discovery of the ships complicates this mythology. They are not the romantic, shattered ruins of a glorious last stand. They are quiet, orderly witnesses to a prolonged, grinding endurance and a methodical, desperate retreat. The men remained sailors to the very end, their discipline holding even as their bodies failed them. This unsettling reality challenges the simple frames of heroism or blame, leaving us with a more profound ambiguity. The Franklin expedition endures in our imagination because it resists a simple ending. It's a story that every generation can approach with new questions about leadership, technology versus nature, culture, and the absolute limits of human survival. The rigid discipline that was meant to ensure order actually prevented them from adapting to their environment, from learning from the Inuit, who knew how to survive their Inuit. In the end, the expedition's greatest legacy isn't its disappearance, but its persistence as a cautionary tale. It's a story about what happens when our assumptions are put under unbearable pressure and crumble. The men who sailed on the Erebus in terror believed they were carrying the torch of certainty into the unknown. What they left behind was a timeless lesson in how quickly certainty can dissolve, how order can erode, and how survival can strip away everything we hold dear. The wrecks now rest on the seabed, the final, silent artifacts of that process. They don't offer a verdict on the choices made, they offer only their presence, and the humbling reality that some places can never be mastered, only remembered. The Franklin expedition vanished into the ice, but it never truly disappeared. It settled into the long, cold archive of human ambition, where its lessons are still waiting for us to learn. Thanks for watching.